Welcome to this episode of Listen to Your Coaches. I'm your coach, Mike Wilkins, here with Coach Will Morrill. Today, we're going to talk about what it takes to go from zero to your first fight, primarily in reference to our system and what we as, amateur and professional MMA coaches would like to see.
So I think we should first kind of define what we mean from starting from zero and who this hypothetical person is, because things obviously change with our outliers, right?
Right.
So we are discussing someone who is not an outlier, meaning you don't have a crazy extensive wrestling history, right?
Or any martial art.
Right, exactly. It's not like
history.
you're a Golden Gloves champ who's now switching to MMA.
Switching to MMA, or not division one, a college wrestler switching to MMA.
Exactly.
Perhaps you're already like a purple belt in jiu-jitsu,
Right.
or a world caliber blue belt in jiu-jitsu switching to MMA. We're talking about, you could have experience in those. You could be, for
Right.
example, a high school wrestler.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
But I would still put that at, level zero.
Yeah, exactly. So we're talking about someone who's, again, coming in with minimal to no experience. We're talking about someone who is also young enough to compete in MMA. So this is not for someone who's 50 and wants to have a bucket list fight. That's a very different thing.
Yes.
We're talking about someone who's probably between 18 and 25-ish, something like
Yeah,
that.
somewhere in there. Maybe 28.
And we're going
32.
from, again, having minimal to no skills all the way up to where we personally would be willing to
Start looking for a fight for you. Start
Exactly.
looking to I'd be putting your name into matchmakers.
So, Mike, why don't you start us off? Day one.
All right,
This
so-
person comes in, tells you, hey, I have no experience. I would like to fight.
Right, yeah. And again, no experience would include prior boxing experience, as long as it, to a certain level. If you wrestled in high school, that's great base. But unless you were capable of wrestling in college, then you should have wrestled in college. I would still want you to follow this plan. If you've already started your training, you can kind of figure out where you slot in right now as well, as far as getting towards, the skill level that we would want you to achieve, how you would achieve that skill level for us to start matching your first fight. So, I have a young man or woman walk in, say, hey, I'm interested in fighting MMA. I have a goal to compete in MMA. All right. Do you have advice for me? And I do. All right. So, in my opinion, the first thing that I'm going to want you to do is start taking fundamental jiu-jitsu classes, right? And fundamental striking classes as well. I'm of the opinion that I prefer you to focus on one before the other. That opinion might not fly across the board.
It does not. I don't think it's wrong to start with one and then do the other. And I think that later it's actually very beneficial to do that. I personally think that it's best to start both at once, just because you're learning what you don't know. You know what I mean? And again, I don't think there's any right or wrong way there, but that's just personally what I like. That way, if someone has an understanding of the game. I'm also a little biased there because I do teach a lot of my striking concepts in ways that, jiu-jitsu typically kind of packages their techniques and strategy and everything. So, I don't think it's super right one way or the other, but I do like to see someone who does both initially.
I'm not strongly opposed against you doing both. I just think I see some value in putting a primary focus in a certain area as you're going to be learning these new things, to not separate your focus, too much. Let you really dive down one of the paths. But with that being said, if you're able to do both, if you have the time in your schedule to do both, which is another thing that we would need to talk about. Time in your schedule is an absolute must. Mm-hmm. If you come to me and you're like, hey, I have a goal of fighting in the cage, but I can only train 2 times a week, all right, then you can't fight. You can't fight.
It's just, and if you can, it's going to take years and years and years.
You're just not going to be able to do it, especially under me. Yeah. So, you know what I mean? You got to prioritize certain things, and if your life is just too busy, you have other things that are just too important than that goal, well then, that's just how the cookie crumbles.
Yeah.
And it's just unfortunate. There's a lot of unfortunate things that can happen that can, keep you from doing things you would like to do and not having the time, which this requires a decent amount of time.
A lot of time.
Would be one of them. I would say if you are going to start with one as opposed to the other, if you're unable to maybe start with both, or you also feel like maybe like the way that you learn, you might be better off focusing on one before the other, I would say jujitsu first. I have a couple of reasons why, and Will, I would love to hear your feedback on these reasons. Number one, we're talking about the fundamentals here, right? And the fundamentals are incredibly important, okay? That's the foundation in which every single aspect of your game is built on, okay? So if you do not have all the fundamentals down, all right, you are an incomplete package and you're going to be unable to be built upon. Meaning that when it's time to do some more maybe fight specific things that have a higher regard to MMA, right? You're going to be unable to because you miss this certain piece that this would be built on, right? It's like, oh, hey, teach me jujitsu for MMA. All right. Well, the first part of that is jujitsu, right? It's like, oh, but I want to know how to do it with strikes. Well, you have to know how to do it, and then we can talk about how strikes change and adapt those things, right? So the fundamentals of jiu-jitsu are incredibly important requirement, okay? Now, our fundamental program at Stout is currently it's a 24-week curriculum, right? There's a lot of things in jiu-jitsu. There's a lot of positions in jiu-jitsu, and the things that we believe are those fundamental base positions, and the things that we think you should absolutely have in those fundamental base positions, they take 24 weeks for us to get that coverage into it, and most people need to go through it a few times. A lot of our fighters who are currently fighting active, on the roster, actively fighting, even those turning pro, are still taking fundamentals classes. It's something that you can always learn from, add to, and you need to continue to sharpen up. Whereas the striking fundamentals is
8 weeks long.
8 weeks long, right? So right there, we're talking about something that's going to take 3 times as long to even get your first glimpse at. And did you even learn it in your first glimpse at it? Probably not, right? You're probably starting to learn how to learn it, right? So your second time through is when you're going to really start to like understand these fundamentals, because you're also going to have points of reference, right? You're going to have experience in the positions, so you're going to have points of reference. You're going to have successes and failures in the live training, so you're going to have points of reference. So those are some things that I really want you to do.
Yeah.
I would like you to train gi. That might be controversial. Gi doesn't really apply to MMA, as much as no gi does. I don't want you to train gi
Exclusively. Right.
Certainly not. But I would want you to be in one gi class a week. What that does is that enhances the amount of partners that you may have depending on your athleticism, right? And it forces you into maybe a little cleaner technique with your fundamentals, okay? So what I see with a lot of people who aspire to be MMA fighters, they typically have a certain level of athleticism to them.
Yes.
I certainly did, right? And one of the things that happened with me is, I would use my speed, maybe my background in wrestling, and, just a little bit of my athleticism to my advantage, which would then kind of work against me when it came to really understanding and applying the technique. All right. When you're in the gi, it kind of turns the volume down on your athleticism. You're not as fast. You're not as strong. You're not as agile. Yeah, things like that. So what it does, since it kind of turns down the volume on your athleticism, people who you might beat or achieve success with,
Right.
not beat, achieve success with, because of your superior athleticism, you won't now. So now, like if hey, I'm having good rounds with, Joe, Tim, Bob, and Jess, right? But I'm not having good rounds with Robert and Jim, because I'm just too athletic for them. Well, now I'm having good rounds with them as well, because the gi kind of muted
Slows
that.
things
Yeah,
down,
slows
yeah.
it down. Yeah, it takes away the athleticism a bit, and especially early on, it does. So it forces you to, actually do the technique for what the technique is for. Also, our lessons, that same lesson runs the entire week. You know
Yep.
what I mean? So it's not like there's a new lesson every day. The same lesson runs the entire week, and we hit that each week. Which at the end, I believe that you have a good solid base understanding of all the positions that I would consider fundamental.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So how about?
Yeah, I agree. Again, if you do start one or the other, I would lean towards starting with jujitsu, not super, like if someone wanted to start with striking, I would be like, no, absolutely not. But I would lean towards starting with jiu-jitsu. I think jiu-jitsu has a tradition of learning a little bit more completely. I think the people sometimes are drawn towards striking who aren't truly like in love with martial arts. You know what I mean? They're like, oh, this is gonna be like a cool workout and stuff. And I have to, to some degree, make the curriculum, represent that. So I think one of the big things that you'll see that's different between your fundamental curriculum and my fundamental curriculum is, aside from the time difference, is in those 8 weeks, we're going to somewhat touch on positions, but we are mostly going to be showing you techniques, right? So you're going to learn like a technique, like a movement, right? Like a round kick, right? And maybe the defense to that. But we're not going to talk about what position we're throwing it from. We're not going to talk about open versus closed stances. And I might kind of sprinkle that in a little bit here and there, but like that's not really what it's about. I want you to build that base of having those specific techniques. And then in later classes, we kind of get into the implementation of it in the positions. So bringing it back to jiu-jitsu, I think jiu-jitsu does a really good job of teaching it the other way around, right? Of teaching position first and
Yes.
then teaching those techniques. And that's really what I would like for a fighter, someone who's going to use these techniques to be thinking about. So again, at least in our system, I would lean towards someone starting with jiu-jitsu. But again, I kind of think it's better to start with both, but only barely. And if someone was like, "Nah, I really want to start with striking," right on. That works too.
Yeah, I could be lenient into that. But just the fact that the jujitsu, because it's a requirement here.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, you can't, you can't do what I need you to do to fight without knowing all the fundamentals that I've assigned.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, any one of those that you don't know is just, it's a no-go.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? So since it does take longer to get through, that's why I definitely would strongly urge, if you're not doing both, start with jiu-jitsu.
Yeah.
Right? We also have MMA techniques classes, which is a very strong curriculum as well. What that would entail would be, kind of like the fundamental bridges which MMA are. All right. And when I look at the MMA techniques class, I look at certain things like what combines the striking to the grappling.
Mm-hmm.
What's that intermediate zone, right? Like it's kind of like a Venn diagram, right? And it's like we've got these two bubbles and then they overlap, and like what's in that overlap. So we do deal a lot with what's in that overlap, such as proactive and reactive takedowns, which are utilizing striking into grappling, right? We utilize striking while grappling with dealing with strikes on the ground and how that changes certain positions. But the most of it is basically, just that. It's like, again, the fundamentals like in jiu-jitsu, but with the addition of the strikes for MMA. Now, the thing with it is that doesn't overtake the fundamentals of jiu-jitsu. Right? It's not like, oh, well, I don't want to compete in jiu-jitsu. I want to compete in MMA, so I'll just go do the MMA techniques class. You're not going to be able to do the techniques without having those fundamentals of jiu-jitsu.
It's a supplement.
It's a supplement to
exactly.
it, right? So it's almost, in a way, it's kind of like that next step, right? Like, it's like, all right, well, like, there's nothing in the fundamental jiu-jitsu curriculum that does not relate to MMA. It's not like, oh, well, this is not an MMA specific thing. Like if you were to think of something like gi specific, like a lasso or something, that's not in the fundamental curriculum, right? That's an intermediate like technique there. So every single thing in the fundamental curriculum is applicable to MMA because it teaches you a way that you need to move your body. It teaches you a concept of grappling that will directly apply, right? And it might not directly apply, like it's like, oh, well, since there's strikes, now we need to do this. Yeah, but you can't add those strikes in if you can't move your body in the manner that I'm asking you of from fundamentals jiu-jitsu, right? But in MMA techniques class, that is where we add those strikes in and things of that nature. So, and that currently is a 20-week curriculum, in which I wouldn't say that you have to finish the fundamental jiu-jitsu before you start the MMA techniques curriculum. It's a good supplement. You can run them side by side. I would recommend you not start the fundamental MMA class until after about 6 to 8 to 12 weeks of the jiu-jitsu.
Right. Just so you're aware of some of the
Aware of it.
positions.
What it's
and
going to
how
do, it's going to
learn.
make your learning curve faster.
Exactly.
And like that's what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to make this efficient. You can do this in a wildly other way, right? You could, be like, oh, I'm going to do striking for 2 years and then jiu-jitsu. Well, then right there, you're already talking about taking longer than we're looking at. We're looking at what we believe is the most efficient route from walking through the door to walking in the cage.
Yeah.
You know, so I would recommend like jiu-jitsu, and then you're going to have the building blocks to then add in like, okay, now I'm playing a guard, but now there's strikes involved. So here goes how I need to use my arms now. But it's not that hard to learn because I don't have to learn how to use my hips and my legs right now as well as my arms. I don't have to learn how to use all three things together because I've already learned the motion of my hips and my legs in jiu-jitsu. So I'm only adding in one new element.
Exactly.
Right? So I'm going to more efficiently learn that. And I do, like, I pretty much can guarantee that in order for you to walk in through the door your first day with, the experience level that we're referencing to coming into my fight team practice, you've gone through both.
Yes.
You've gone in from from week 1 to week 1 all the way through both. Now you can jump in on these curriculums. They are labeled by week. The number of the week, it's honestly irrelevant. It's just to like
14 to 14.
Yeah. Like you can start in any week. You don't need to start at week 1. They don't necessarily build off each other. They do touch each other, but the starting point can be at any point in time in the curriculum. You can start on any day, and you're going to do just fine in your learning process. They are mainly numbered, so that way when I'm telling an instructor, like, all right, we're on week 4, like, you know what I mean?
Keeps
just
everyone on
help
the
to
same
keep
page.
us ordered.
Okay, so let's say that, this person has gone through their entire fundamentals. They've started doing a couple of, MMA classes, and they're ready for the next step. What is the next step?
The next step is the fight team, training with the fight team.
No. They've only done jiu-jitsu.
Oh, they haven't done strike. I thought your striking was included.
No. So they finished that first.
Okay, so here goes my thing. I would say
switch to striking.
I would say we're switching to striking. So if you're doing jiu-jitsu only, right when you're ready to start adding in the MMA techniques class, you are also adding in striking. I would actually encourage you to add in the striking before the MMA techniques class. Okay?
Because then you have multiple bases.
Yes, because the striking is going to be involved in certain weeks of the MMA techniques class. In the MMA techniques class, again, we're not doing anything strictly striking. Right? But it's striking into grappling exchanges, meaning that we're going to be using our strikes to enter into our takedowns. So if you already have an understanding on how you're supposed to stand when you strike, how your body moves when you're striking, it's going to make you learning, because the bulk of that lesson is the takedown. It's not the strikes. The strikes are the supplemental portion. So I would like you to already have done your fundamental striking prior to entering into the MMA techniques. I don't need you to finish your fundamentals jiu-jitsu, right? I don't need you to have finished it, but I would like you to have 6 to 12 weeks that grasp of it. And then I would like you to have, maybe finished your fundamentals, striking. And here's the thing, like, your goal is to perform in the cage. Your goal is to fight, right? And that is something to take very seriously. You know what I mean? Not saying that we shouldn't take like a jiu-jitsu tournament serious, but there's a lot less on the line there. I've had people enter jiu-jitsu tournaments after training for a mere weeks, right? They don't even know what I don't recommend that at all.
Yeah.
They don't even know what certain positions are, which is why I don't recommend it. But you're gonna be all right. You're gonna be relatively safe, right? By no circumstance would I allow you to enter into an MMA fight, and that brings us to a key point here. You need us to fight MMA, right? Like, if you're going to fight in the state of Pennsylvania, you have an experience form that needs to be signed by a reputable
coach.
In order for your license to be accepted.
And if someone comes into the gym and has been training for like 3 weeks and they're like, hey, Mike, would you sign this experience for me?
Won't do it.
No.
Because then who knows, my I don't know how the commission does it, but maybe they withdraw my say and the ability to sign people. They're like, no, you're sending in people unfit.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, it's another thing. You want to take pride in your work, and this is my work. So
for sure.
Yeah, the product that I put in the cage, I want to represent well. That doesn't mean oh, you went and you lost your fight. You made me embarrassed or
Right, right.
You
It's
ruined
not
my
about
reputation.
that.
It's not about that at all. I mean,
What
we
we are
lose fights
concerned with,
often, but
we're concerned with someone getting in the cage and then, being put in a position or, being hit with, strategy or tactics that they have no idea about, that they
yeah,
didn't even know were a thing.
right? Like if that were to occur, if I put you in the cage for your debut and you were hit with some shit that like you had no idea was a thing, then what I would like to believe happened is your opponent was kind of like had some like experience that we were not made aware of. You know
And
what I
even
mean?
then, you should at least be aware of it.
Or you're an outlier. Or
Yeah.
the opponent's an outlier. The
Right, right,
opponent's
right.
an outlier. It's like, yeah, man, like I mean, oh, but like yeah, aware of it. You might get outclassed.
Yeah, yeah,
in it.
that's fine.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
But
people are like
if
sometimes you're better, sometimes you're not.
if you're in the cage for the first time and you're getting hit with switch kicks and you're like, dude, you come back in between rounds, you're like, I didn't even know that was a kick. I didn't know kicks could come on this side. And we're like, well, that's a problem right there.
Yeah, exactly.
Or they're like, how do I defend that? And I'm like, well, you should know. We've had multiple classes,
Yeah.
So,
There you go.
okay, so hold on. So we're on this journey. So someone comes in, they've been doing maybe 6 weeks of fundamentals. They're kind of getting a feel for it. They start picking up striking. Okay, so now they've done, maybe they've gotten through all 8 weeks of the fundamentals curriculum. And they started to pick up some MMA techniques. I would also like to see someone do some boxing classes, which is we call it an all levels class.
Before going into MMA techniques?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
Or at least simultaneously, right? And boxing allows me to then, kind of how I talked about in fundamentals striking, I'm worried about the strikes, right?
Right.
Boxing, because the strikes are now much less complex, it's just punching. Now we can focus a little bit more on positioning, and we can start to sprinkle in a little bit more about open and closed stance, and a little bit more about range, and a little bit more about levels, and some of the things that matter positionally standing up, right?
Yeah.
So again, let's just say that they've been doing that. And maybe they've been training total for, I don't know, 6 to 8 months at this point, and
Yeah.
they're doing pretty well. Maybe they're in open mats. They've been through the entire, fundamentals curriculum on both of our ends. They're in my intermediate classes. They're in your intermediate classes. What's the next step now?
I mean, if you've been training for 6 to 8 months, so my fundamentals curriculum 24 weeks, it's roughly 6 months, right? And like I said, your first month in it, like you're just learning how to learn.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like I don't expect you to retain a ton of actual technique from that month. What you're retaining is like, oh, this is how I need to learn the technique or the concepts or whatever it may be. So, like, let's say you started on week 1, right? It's not like, oh, week 24, which is the end. Ah, done. I got it, right?
Check that box.
As I said, even our pro fighters are still taking these classes. But I would say, like, you're going week 1 back to week 8.
Yeah.
Because like those first 6 weeks, they were just right over your head. Not entirely, but like you weren't getting everything out of it that you needed to because you're learning how to learn it.
Exactly.
Right? So that's fine. So you've passed your fundamentals, doing some of the boxing, you're entering into the MMA techniques. All right. Now when you're doing this, we're adding these classes on, right? So does that mean you go from taking 4 classes a week to 6 to 8? It might mean that. But you can double these classes.
Exactly.
Right?
So if you're only coming into the gym 4 times a week, that doesn't mean that
you
now
could do
after
a striking, you could do a boxing and a jiu-jitsu. You could do an MMA techniques and a jiu-jitsu, an MMA techniques and a striking. You'd be able to get multiple of these classes in. For example, on a Saturday, you can hit your fundamental no-gi class at 10 a.m. in the strip, and then bam, you got an 11 a.m. MMA techniques class. You're good to go. You can hit your MMA techniques class at 5:30 on a Tuesday, and then hit your fundamental gi class right after, or maybe you're past the fundamentals of striking, and then you're going into your clinch class right after that. So there's ways to
consolidate your training a little
these.
bit. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, this is just what it takes. Now, what I would say, if you did go through the entire fundamentals curriculum, you could knock it back, right? It's like, okay, it's my second time going through, right? I have a grasp over it. I'm now adding in these MMA techniques classes. Maybe you drop it down to 1 fundamentals class a week at this point in time because you are supplementing it with the MMA techniques class. But again, if you don't have those fundamentals, you are not going to be learning at the efficient rate. You'll still be learning, but not at the efficient rate that you're wanting to learn because we're assuming you're gung-ho, you're trying to get in the cage.
Yes.
All right? So you've made it through that. I honestly, I'd like to see you compete before stepping in foot on the fight team. You know what I mean? I'd love to see you go do, like, first off, I absolutely don't want to see your MMA debut be your first competition.
Yeah, definitely not.
So much so to the point where I consider banning it.
Yeah.
You know, I might consider banning it. And again, this is for, you know, coming in with the experience level that we're discussing, not an outlier, right? If you've had 1,000 wrestling matches and you're coming in you're coming in a year removed from college wrestling, then like, you know, that's not what I'm talking about, right? You've competed, right? I don't want your first competition, you know, of that magnitude to be in the cage.
Yeah.
So I would absolutely want you to compete in a jiu-jitsu tournament or two. And you know, that could coincide. Ideally, it happens before you start fight team practices, but it could come, you know, shortly
Similar-ish
thereafter.
time.
Similar-ish time.
And see, that's kind of what I'm thinking on my end as well, because right around now, we're talking about, you know, the time where someone has been through all of my fundamentals. They've probably been through my entire intermediate curriculum at least once, which isn't enough, but, you know, at least you've seen everything. You've seen all of the positions you need to, so it's another 10 weeks there. And that's the earliest that I would promote someone to advanced. And before I would feel comfortable throwing them into fight team practice where they're going to be doing some sparring, I would like for them to be in advance for at least a couple of months, you know, so
that's what we're seeing there. We're seeing a good, like, you know what, maybe what this is doing is kind of helping us figure out a system that we should, you know, be recommending.
yeah.
You know, we talked about the 24-week fundamental jiu-jitsu curriculum. Well, within that time frame, you could also, you know, get yourself through the intermediate fundamentals and intermediate striking, right? You know, it's 24 weeks, but as I said, it's probably more like 30 to 32 weeks, which would certainly, you know, get you through either one thing of fundies, two thing of fundies, and one thing of intermediate, or one thing of fundies and two things of intermediate striking, which could have you in a great spot, you know, as you're entering in the MMA techniques class.
So to take it back to competition, ideally what I would like to see is around this time, they do a jiu-jitsu tournament, right? And then maybe they start to shift their focus after that a little heavier on the striking. And then maybe a year into their striking training, or, you know, somewhere around there, maybe take a Muay Thai fight before, or a kickboxing fight.
What we could be seeing is like, I mean, like, you should be taking a jiu-jitsu competition with, if your goal is to fight, you probably should be taking a jiu-jitsu competition around the 6-month mark of training.
Right.
Potentially earlier, maybe a little bit later. Because, like, ideally you should get a few in, you know?
Yeah.
And they're not hard to get in. There's one probably on average every 6 weeks.
Yeah.
Locally available on average every 6 weeks. So, like, you're going to be able to get them in and the more you get in, the better.
Yeah.
You know? So, like, yeah, I mean, yeah.
But what I'm saying is I would like to see someone do jiu-jitsu first, just get that competition experience, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Then ideally, and it doesn't always work out this way, but ideally then have a striking, you know, fight.
Yeah, but here's the thing with the striking fight. Like, if you're having a striking fight, you're already on the fight team.
At least striking-wise, yeah. Advanced.
Yeah, I mean, unless you, I mean, you're going to be on the fight team then.
Yeah.
Unless you were doing only striking and you were waiting on doing the jiu-jitsu thing, right? So, like, that's where, like, a jiu-jitsu tournament and a Muay Thai fight, in my opinion, are going to be different.
And that's my point.
Like, jiu-jitsu tournaments are things that can happen prior to the fight team and should happen.
Yes.
And should happen prior to the fight team. Whereas, you're not taking a Muay Thai fight until you're already on the team.
Exactly.
Right? That should be something that, like, we consider strongly before an MMA fight.
That's exactly my point. I think that's the best order of events.
Right. Yeah. So I could see you getting on this team, like practicing with the team within the 8-month to a year mark.
Exactly.
You know, assuming that you're hitting all these steps. Now that you're practicing on the team, you're getting into some sparring. You're learning what I would consider would be the intermediate level of MMA, right? You're still touching your fundamental jiu-jitsu here. You're hitting your open mats for jiu-jitsu. You're hitting your striking classes, your clinch class. But then at the fight team practices, that's where, you know, we're running through our fight-specific strategies and things like that. You're getting your sparring, and you're definitely preparing. You're in fight team practice. You are preparing to fight.
Exactly.
You are preparing to fight. All right. So now that preparation turns into, hey, do we think it's, you know, valuable to get you a striking fight? Now the problem with that is those are a little harder to come by. It's actually far easier to get an MMA fight than a Muay Thai fight.
Significantly.
Yeah.
Okay, but let's say that hypothetically this all works out perfectly. You know, 8 months to a year in, you know, they're 2-3 jiu-jitsu tournaments in. You know, somewhere between 9 and, I don't know, 14 months, they've taken a Muay Thai or kickboxing fight, and they've done relatively well in all of these.
Yeah.
Now what?
But I think you're ready.
Yeah, I agree.
I think you're ready. So at that point in time, we're like, hey, let's start looking at some dates so I can start putting your name out to promoters. And the way that would work, I think this might be an interesting topic. I don't know if fighters exactly know how it works, right? So it's like, all right, here goes, the blessing to fight, right? We discuss, me and you, we discuss, okay, like you want to fight, you're ready to fight, we think you're ready. These things, all right, now we're going to start looking at some dates, all right? And we're like, okay, so, 247 has fights on December 16th, right? WFC has fights on January 27th. Made Men has fights on February 17th. The 247's back again February 24th, right? So we're like, okay, like, do any of these dates not work for you, right? Okay, well, yeah, January 27th is my brother's wedding. All right, cool, got you, boom, boom, boom. We put your name out. I go, hey, here goes Will Morrill, 170-pound 0-0 debuter, all right? I give some extra, information. High school wrestler, 3-stripe white belt in jiu-jitsu, decent athlete, right? Bang, okay? Now your name's in, and promoters will then hit me back and they'll be like, okay, I have Joe Smith from this gym in Ohio. He is also 0-0. He has a blue belt in jiu-jitsu. He's never wrestled, and he's been training striking for a year, and then we, kind of like see like, oh, is that a good fit? And we accept the match. Now, just because I'm putting your name in, that doesn't mean you're getting a fight.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
They might not have an opponent that matches for you. Right. Like, we want to get the appropriate fight. Right. They might be like, oh, you know what? We do have a 170-pounder, but he's 3-1. Well, dude, I'm not putting you in that situation.
So, okay, so this is an interesting thing too. Maybe this is a little beyond the scope of this conversation, but what would make you say no to an opponent for a first fight?
I just feel like the experience level is steeply favored against you.
Yeah.
Right? Steeply. Now, if like, here's the thing. You can't just, this is amateur fighting right now we're talking about. You can't look for wins everywhere. Right? But what we're going to look for is at least fair competition for us.
Yes. Yes.
We will accept unfair competition if it's in our favor.
Yeah.
Because then that's experience for you.
Exactly.
That's mat time and cage time. I'm not looking for it, but if it comes our way, we're not saying no, right? The way I look at it is like, and even at the pro level, like I feel the same, right? Okay, so I was an electrician, right? So imagine I'm a pro fighter. I'm making my pro debut or I'm making my amateur debut, and I've got a certain level of wrestling experience. Okay, I'm an amateur fighter. I've got a certain level of wrestling experience, all right? I'm a blue belt in jiu-jitsu. And, I've been training striking for like a year. Well, here goes this guy who's willing to fight me. He's never wrestled. He's a white belt, and he's been training striking for 3 months, right? But he's accepted to fight me. Should I say no because I'm too experienced for him? No. Just as when I was an electrician and someone called me, Mike, my outlets are out in my bathroom. Oh, I can't figure out what's going on. And I go to their panel and I flip that breaker and I'm like, yeah, you tripped your breaker, right? Should I not go do that? Dude, that job was too easy.
Yeah.
No. You still go do the easy job.
Right.
Right? You still go do it. So like, yeah, I would do that. But as an electrician, would I show up to a job that is out of my capabilities and be like, okay, I'll do it. And then, it's not be able to perform the service required.
40-story commercial building.
Yeah, and I'm like, this is way over my head.
Yeah.
Right? So that's a way that I look at it. But, we prefer as even a matchup as possible that's going to build you in the way that we would like, which is why you see our amateurs take very tough fights towards the end of their amateur career. And at the beginning of an amateur career, a lot of times you don't know, right? An 0-0 versus an 0-0, right? Dude, someone's the next George St. Pierre.
Yeah.
That dude was 0-0, right? And you're like, you fight that dude, and you're like, well, he's the next one. You just got the luck of the draw. We had no information on him. He was 0-0. This is all it was.
So I don't know if this is true, but I saw like an Instagram thing years ago, and it was a Tapology profile, and it was a guy who was 0-2. First one, knockout loss, Chuck Liddell.
Oh my God.
Second one, and maybe I'm mixing up the order of it, but knockout
Detour.
loss, Rampage Jackson.
Oh, wow.
So it's like, does that guy suck? No. He
No.
just, happened to run into killers because everyone's 0-0 at some point. But taking it back to getting to that point, so again, they've had all of these bases of fundamentals and they've worked their way through, starting to get to the intermediate level classes. They've seen some boxing, they've seen some MMA specific stuff. They're on the fight team for a certain amount of time and we feel their skills are at an acceptable level. We've seen them in competition. They're ready to rock. Overall, all right, and we kind of said this, but for the average guy, give me a time frame. What's that look like?
Would it look to take like all that?
Yeah.
I would say between 10 to 16 months.
Yeah.
10 to 16 months. And if you think that's too long, take a hike.
Yeah, and that's
Get out of here.
I think that's a problem with, because think about who gets drawn towards fighting. Oftentimes it's, younger people who are maybe a little aggressive and maybe not exactly thinking long term, right?
Yeah.
Maybe not looking at delayed gratification. And they're like, oh, well, I got to wait a year. I could go to this gym and fight in 3 months.
Go to that gym and fight in 3 months, please.
Exactly. If that's your attitude, go
We'll
ahead
fight
and
you.
do that. Yeah, for sure.
Go to that gym.
I got a guy for you. 3 months, give me a call.
We'll fight you. Yeah. See, the thing is like, I'm trying to hold a certain, like as I said earlier, trying to hold a certain value, and I saw something not too long ago, for like a coach, right? Like it's like, hey, it's not what you preach, it's what you tolerate, right? And those are your standards.
Yes.
So like, you know what I mean? I'm trying to tolerate a higher level, so that way we put out a better product and it's better for everybody because I'm serving you best as well.
Exactly.
Right? If I rush you in there, I'm not serving you the way that I think I should. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
And so going back to the time frame thing, you told me this one time, and I thought this was a really good point, is that if someone thinks they're like, oh, I have to wait a year till I can fight. Well, dude, how long does it take to go from being an amateur fighter to being a pro fighter?
For most people, like 4 years.
Yeah.
It's like a college. It's like college. It's like, yeah. It's like playing college ball.
Yeah.
Right? You know what I mean? Like, oh, like, yeah. It's like 4 years. Like my amateur career started December 15th, 2007. And my pro career started November 11th or November 12th, 2011. Right? Mm-hmm. Dude, that's a month shy of 4 years.
And let's just say it took you a year to get to that point. We're talking about 5 years from nothing to pro. And I'm
think
stealing
about that.
Your point right here. Like you literally told me this at some point, is that like, when you think about that being a long time, that year, if you said, hey man, I could take you from nothing to being in the NFL in 5 years.
Yeah. Come on now.
It doesn't happen.
Yeah,
you
no.
know?
Yeah.
So like you should be looking at this like, oh wow, this is the fast track into, higher level athletics.
Yeah.
Or even the lower level athletics. You know what I mean? Like you're not gonna go from having zero basketball experience to playing for a college team in a year.
Yeah.
Doesn't happen.
For
right?
sure.
So like this is honestly still one of the fastest ways.
Dude, I mean like in your amateur, it's like, dude, just like we're equating this to like other sports, you can equate it to almost a lot of industries, right? Like any industry that requires a college degree, right? Okay, like, dude, that took 4 years.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And now you're able to work in this field, right? Like you're looking to, if you're talking about professional fighting, that's work in that field, right? That's what you're doing for money.
Yeah.
Like obviously it's going to take some time. You have outliers. You're like, oh, my buddy, he went pro, after 18 months or whatever. I'm like, oh wow, that's pretty quick. He must have been pretty good. Yeah, he wrestled Division I at, West Virginia. Yeah. Blah, blah, blah. Like, okay, so now we're talking about an outlier, right? Like, yeah.
And also, more importantly, say he wrestled for 10 years, so he had 10 years experience.
Oh, so he wrestled Division I for 4 years, and then, probably didn't go to Division I. He probably wrestled since like 4th grade.
Exactly.
So so he already had 16 years of experience.
Yeah.
Coming in.
Right.
To MMA, and then on top of that, his 18-month amateur career.
And additionally, I think this is so important. Like, getting to your first fight is not something you should rush. Like,
yeah, no.
We're talking about something serious. You know what I mean? And like, probably you're going to be okay in your first fight. Probably. The refs understand that it's amateurs. They're trying to keep you safe. But you and I have both seen people get knocked out horribly in amateur fighting. You know what I mean? And like, that's not good. We've seen freak accidents happen. And not that you can stop all of those, but again, we want to mitigate that risk as much as possible by preparing you the best that we can.
Absolutely. And like that year in hindsight is not long at all, right? Like I feel like if you ask most people like, hey, what level of jiu-jitsu do you think an amateur MMA fighter should have? Do you think it should be a white belt? Or do you think they could be a blue belt? Right?
Ideally, a blue belt.
Yeah, people are like, I probably, you probably should know know some jujitsu before fighting MMA. Okay. So like blue belt level? Oh yeah. Okay, well, it's like a year to 2 years to get your blue belt. You know what I mean? Like, so, in hindsight, it might seem when it's in front of you, it might seem like it's far away. But once it's behind you, you know you didn't come that far. Like it wasn't that far.
Let me ask you this: could you imagine getting submitted with something and not knowing what that submission was called?
No. No. I mean, it would have to be something like incredibly unique for me to be like, oh, I've never heard of this before.
Yeah.
If I were to think of like, are you referencing the, he did a triangle on my shoulder. He called it an omoplata.
Yes.
Yeah, that was a good story. Why don't you enlighten them on this story?
There's some details I'm fuzzy on, but we were in Akron, I
We were in
believe?
Akron at the Chaparral Center
Yeah.
for some MMA fights. In the warm-up room was a child's daycare.
So Mike and I are back there, and we're getting our guys warm. I don't remember who was fighting, and at one point I'm sitting next to Warren, and a kid comes back, and he had just lost his fight, and he's holding an ice pack on his shoulder, and he goes, "Oh man, this dude put a triangle choke on my shoulder. I think they called it an omoplateau." And I like had to contain myself from laughing. I looked over at Warren. Warren just looked disappointed, and he was like, and he just got up and left. He just couldn't handle it.
He couldn't handle it.
And I would never want to be that guy. So
I would never want to be that guy. I would never want to be that guy's coach.
yeah.
I'd be so embarrassed.
If you're a young fighter who
Getting submitted by one is something different. Getting submitted by it and be like, oh, I didn't know you could do that. Like, yeah,
that's not good. That's not good. So yeah, if you're a young fighter and you're like, oh, I really want to get in the cage, just remember you don't want to be that guy.
Yeah.
So take the time, learn things properly, and again, at the end of that year, year to year and a half, it depends. It'll have flown by, and you'll be really happy that you did that.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, so that's a pretty good timeline, a pretty good idea on like the route that, if you're looking to fight, especially out of Stout PGH, the route that the Stout PGH fights coaches are looking for you to take. So there goes some insight there. Mm-hmm. Hopefully you can use it. Maybe you're already on that journey and, I haven't been approached by too many people about the exact path. So maybe you can utilize that for yourself and be like, oh, okay, I'm already, 6 months into my jiu-jitsu, so I should be hitting these competitions and getting my striking in. And now I see the route that's going to most efficiently get me to that fight team, those fight team practices, which are going to get me into the cage.
Absolutely.
Right on.
Maybe at a later date we'll have to do a podcast about from accepting the fight to walking into the cage.
Yep. Yeah.
But that's a whole different conversation.
Sounds like a good one to me. Yeah. All right. Well, that's this episode of Listen to Your Coaches, and we'll see you next time.